Ethan Blake raised his hand and struck the woman across the face, the sharp crack slicing through the empty street and making the night itself pause for a single breath. It lasted only a moment, yet Ethan felt something slip violently out of his control. Her glossy black SUV still sat parked along the curb, the street light reflecting off its surface like a witness to the arrogance he believed he had just crushed. But in the blink of an eye, he knew he was wrong. Dr. Maya Thompson stood still, her small frame in a deep blue blazer, neither trembling nor recoiling, only tilting her head slightly, so her face met the full wash of golden light above. The red mark across her cheek glowed like a stamped seal, but her eyes were so cold that Ethan felt his breath rise and lock in his throat. What he saw in them was not fear. It was contempt, the steady stillness of someone holding power far greater than her appearance suggested. A kind of calm that made Ethan's wrist tighten without thinking, as if he had just struck steel hidden beneath silk. Night wind swept down Riverton Street, carrying the faint metallic ring of a distant chime. Ethan suddenly felt the space around him expand unnaturally wide, and the silence after the slap unsettled him more than any heated argument could. She did not react. She did not shout. She did not fight back. She only looked at him, a gaze sharp as the cleanest, most precise cut he had ever seen. Then she spoke softly, her voice like velvet, yet cutting straight into his spine. "You will pay." Ethan let out a derisive laugh. Lies, he thought. A woman driving a luxury car at 2 o'clock in the morning through Riverton Heights. A black woman, far too confident, acting as though she belonged here. He knew this type well. People who thought the law did not apply to them. People who needed to be reminded who truly held the power. The thought steadied him, but that steadiness lasted barely a few seconds. A small click sounded nearby. Ethan glanced toward the corner. A young man stood under a street lamp phone, raised the glow lighting his face. Recording. Of course he was recording. Ethan gritted his teeth and yelled after him, but Maya's gaze pulled him sharply back. She stepped one pace backward, not slumping like those he had intimidated before, instead standing upright as if he were the one being asked for identification. Ethan drew in a sharp breath. He needed to regain control. Fast. He grabbed her wrist, twisted it hard, and snapped the cuffs on. The metal sprang shut with a chilling clarity, leaving a red mark on her skin, yet she did not cry out, not even a little. Something tightened inside Ethan's chest. Normally, the silence of his victims pleased him. This time, it made him uneasy, as if he had just walked into a trap. Maya was pushed into the back seat of the patrol car, but she sat upright as though preparing for an important meeting. Ethan glanced at the rearview mirror and met her eyes in the darkness. They were not the eyes of someone humiliated. They were the eyes of someone observing, assessing, recording. A coldness slid down his hands and his breath grew shallow. Frustration surged up to hide it, and he slammed the accelerator, wanting to leave the unsettling scene behind. But inside him, a shadow began to take shape. He sensed it even if he refused to name it. A premonition. A small, persistent warning. Something his arrogance tried to bury, but could not smother. Meanwhile, Maya, her hands cuffed, let her head rest lightly against the seat and closed her eyes. Not from exhaustion, but because she was listening, remembering waiting for the moment he would push himself off a cliff without understanding how. As the car sped through Riverton, her eyes opened again in the mirror. Silent. Cold. Like a prophecy slowly coming into form. And in that exact moment, Ethan had no idea that the slap he thought was only a minor lesson would become the spark that would burn his entire life to the ground, slowly but inevitably, as the night moved on with every beat of the city's pulse. He would be pushed closer to the price she had promised, and he would pay, with everything he had ever believed he controlled. The glass doors of the Riverton Central Police Station flew open as Ethan Blake dragged Maya Thompson inside his shoes, striking the cold tile floor with sharp metallic echoes. He walked in with the familiar posture of a man who believed the entire building belonged to him, that anyone who saw him should step aside. But the moment Maya stepped beneath the white lights of the reception hall, the atmosphere shifted as if someone had squeezed the air out of it. The murmured conversations stopped instantly. A coffee cup froze in midair. The dispatcher dropped his pen to the floor. Ethan had no idea why everyone was staring at him with that expression, a mixture of shock and fear. He assumed they were startled because he had brought in a defiant woman in the middle of the night, or perhaps the street-side video had already started spreading. But that was only the assumption of a man still far from the truth. Maya stood tall as she was pushed toward the counter, wrists still cuffed, her calm composure almost aggravating, as if she were the one arriving to conduct official business. An invisible aura surrounded her, making the younger officers in the corner unconsciously straighten and slow their movements. No one spoke. No one stepped forward to help Ethan as they usually did. Only the cold hum of the air conditioner poured down, making the room feel even heavier. Irritated, Ethan slammed the file onto the desk, raising his voice more than necessary. Charge her for obstructing an officer and refusing to comply. Photograph fingerprint hold her overnight. But the officer on duty, Jensen, barely older than his early 20s and visibly trembling, did not move. He stared at Maya as if seeing the ghost of his own future. Jensen swallowed hard before speaking, his voice so faint it felt like a curse released into the air. You can't do that to her. Ethan ground his teeth. Her who a lawyer. Some VIP. He stepped closer to Jensen, lowering his voice, until each word hissed between his teeth. Are you drunk? Do your job. But Jensen only shook his head. His eyes locked on Maya as if drawn to a truth he had not fully processed. No one moved. The entire lobby felt frozen beneath an invisible layer of ice. Ethan turned toward the other officers. What is wrong with all of you? I brought in someone who resisted orders. Do your jobs. But they backed away even farther, as if he had just fired a gun in the middle of the room. A door slammed open. Footsteps pounded rapidly across the floor. Captain Sandra Ruiz burst in, breathless, her phone still lit in her hand. She looked at Maya first, then at Ethan, and a sheet of pale shock washed across her face so quickly Ethan could not comprehend it. Ruiz lunged forward like a sudden gust, yanking Ethan's hand off Maya, nearly shouting. Ethan Blake, what on earth have you done? Do you have any idea who you just arrested? Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but Ruiz stabbed a finger toward Maya, her voice breaking under the weight of rage and fear. That is Chief Maya Thompson, the Chief of Police of Riverton, my direct superior and yours. Time fell into a hollow silence. Ethan stood frozen, his hand still half raised from the motion of shoving Maya toward the counter. A long, dull ringing filled his ears, like the muted roar of a storm gathering to explode. The officers behind him lowered their heads, a few turning away, unable to look at him. Jensen let his arms drop loosely at his sides, looking as if he wished he could disappear. Maya did not need to speak. She simply stood there, her gaze cold and controlled, as if she had known this exact moment would happen, as if she had foreseen every second of it. And Ethan suddenly realized the cuffs he had locked around her wrists now felt like a rope tightening around his own neck. As the lobby fell into total suffocating silence, one truth formed in his chest. That slap. That moment, he thought he was teaching someone a lesson. It had just become the first sentence in a long chain of consequences he never saw coming. And it was only beginning. Rumors spread faster than any siren in the city of Riverton. As Ethan Blake stumbled back, frozen in place by the truth, hurled straight into his face, the looks in the lobby shifted. They were no longer shocked. They had turned into something else, something far worse: apprehension, avoidance, and most cutting of all, pity. As if they were watching a familiar predator have its fangs snapped off in an instant. Captain Sandra Ruiz snatched the keys and unlocked Maya Thompson's cuffs with such speed that Ethan did not even have time to breathe. The metallic click rang out dry and final, like a verdict being delivered. Maya gently rubbed her wrist, the red mark glowing under the harsh neon lights, but she did not flinch. Her silence was what unsettled Ethan most. Not anger, but the calm of someone holding the blade by the handle. She took one step toward him, not raising her voice, yet every word fell with the weight of a landslide. "You chose your path, Officer Blake, and every path has a destination." Ethan wanted to snap back, wanted to salvage whatever authority he still believed he had, but his throat felt stripped dry, as if every drop of moisture had been pulled out of him. Not a single word escaped. The officers he had shouted at, commanded, and led through tough night shifts now looked at him like they were watching a corpse that simply had not realized it was dead. Phone notifications buzzed across the room. A young officer lifted his screen with trembling hands. The video of the slap replayed, thousands of comments flashing beneath it in an endless stream. Ethan heard his own voice in the clip rough cold, issuing orders, threatening. But when Maya appeared on screen taking the slap, without bowing, without faltering, her stare slicing through the darkness, he felt as though he was the one being thrown into that moment. Captain Ruiz stepped closer, her voice low but rumbling with a storm. "You need to leave now. The whole city is exploding over this. Blake, you're not safe." Ethan let out a laugh, sharp and distorted. "Not safe. I was doing my job. She disobeyed orders and I handled it. Simple as that." But the moment he finished speaking, every gaze turned away. No one nodded. No one agreed. No one stood on his side. The feeling was strange, like the floor beneath him had begun to tilt. Maya stood beside Ruiz, her eyes still ice cold, but now mixed with something worse: pity. A type of pity Ethan despised more than contempt. The woman he thought he could break with a single slap now looked at him as if he were a child playing with fire he did not understand. She spoke. "I will not address your actions here, not in front of subordinates, but from the moment you laid a hand on me, everything you tried to bury will rise to the surface." Ethan Blake. "I know you think this city belongs to you, but you forgot one thing. I am the one who runs the system you rely on to survive." A sudden explosion outside rattled the lobby windows. Shouts erupted from the front of the station. A crowd had begun to form a sea of people. Phone lights raised anger, spreading like dry paper catching flame. Ethan lurched forward and looked out the glass. They were there, group after group, row after row, shouting his name, not to support him, but to demand his punishment. Ruiz shouted for the doors to be sealed. A metal barrier dropped down, slamming into the ground with the finality of a vault door closing. Ethan turned back to the room and saw Maya still watching him, her expression unchanged, not angry, simply certain. Certain in the way someone is, when they already know the ending. And in that moment, Ethan understood something he had never allowed himself to admit. It wasn't the crowd outside trying to destroy him. It wasn't the video. It wasn't social media. It was Maya. It was the moment he raised his hand and struck her. It was the quiet strength, the unshaken composure, and the authority he had failed to recognize, authority that had just been freed from handcuffs. And a single thought flickered through his mind, cold enough to make his skin crawl. The slap was never the beginning. It was only the warning sign of the collapse he was about to plunge into. A downfall that no one, not even himself, could stop anymore. The shouting outside the station gate slammed against the thick glass like hammer blows, striking straight into Ethan's temples, making his head feel stretched tight enough to burst. Phone lights flickered across the courtyard, casting distorted shadows of furious faces onto the walls, swelling into a wave of anger unlike anything he had ever faced. Not the usual chaos of Riverton. This time the rage was aimed at one name, his. Ethan tried to swallow the tight rising pressure crawling from his chest to his throat, but it sank like a stone heavy and stuck. Inside the lobby, officers instinctively drifted apart, creating an invisible ring of empty space around him. They neither approached nor fled. They simply kept their distance, as if he were the source of the fire raging outside. Maya stood under the harsh white lights, her face calm to the point of cruelty, her hands now free, her eyes sharp enough to cut. She did not rush, did not bark orders, did not need to. Her presence alone silenced the room. Ethan tried to salvage whatever authority remained. He jabbed a finger toward Maya, forcing steel into his voice. This is just a misunderstanding. She disobeyed orders and I responded according to protocol, that's it. Nothing serious happened here. An older officer looked away, the faint, bitter curve of his mouth saying more than any words. No one believed him now. No one stood with him. Jensen, the trembling young officer from earlier, shifted subtly toward Maya, as if being near her was the only safe place left. Ethan clenched his teeth, feeling the ground slipping away beneath him, piece by piece. The office doors burst open. A group of internal affairs officers strode in. They did not speak to him. They did not ask questions. One glance passed over him, and then someone held up a phone showing him the screen. The slap video had already gathered hundreds of thousands of views and was rising by the second. Comments flooded the page like poisonous mushrooms after Rainfire him charge him justice for Maya. Ethan's stomach twisted. He wanted to scream that they did not know the full story, that he was only doing his job, that she provoked him. But even he could hear how weak that sounded inside his own head. Maya tilted her head slightly, her gaze cold, but not cruel. What terrified Ethan most was the absence of hatred. She was not angry. She simply looked at him as if he was witnessing his own inevitable end. An internal affairs officer stepped forward and read the suspension order. His voice was steady and emotionless, each word dropping like nails into a coffin lid. Ethan was ordered to surrender his gun badge and communication devices. He froze for a few seconds, then had no choice but to remove each item, placing them onto the cold metal tray. When the gun hit the tray with a harsh clang, something inside him plunged into a deep, dark pit. Maya stood beside Ruiz, watching him with an unreadable expression. Then she spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for every corner of the room to hear. A person who believes they are the strongest is often the one who falls the fastest. And sometimes, that fall is one they created themselves. Ethan felt his breath tighten. He looked toward the sealed doors where the metal barricade trembled under the force of the crowd screaming his name. They no longer saw him as an officer. They saw a villain whose mask had just been ripped off. In that reflection, Ethan recognized something he had never admitted before. For the first time in his life, he controlled nothing. Not the crowd. Not his fellow officers. Not even his own future. Maya walked out of the lobby, her shadow passing across him as she moved by. Not intentionally, but Ethan felt as though she had just crossed the border between two worlds, one belonging to someone who held power, and one belonging to a man who had lost everything. As her footsteps echoed steadily down the hallway, Ethan remained frozen hollow as a tree stripped of its core. Her words echoed in his mind, sharp and lingering. The slap was only the beginning, and from this moment on, he understood. His life had officially stepped into the dark, with no path left to return. Ethan Blake left the station with footsteps heavy as lead, no gun at his hip, no badge in his wallet, nothing left of the authority he once wore like armor. The Riverton night was thick with dust and cold air. The walkway leading to the parking lot had been split in half by a temporary police barricade, but it did nothing to muffle the rising waves of shouting outside the gate. The insults, the cries for justice, the furious voices calling his name were unmistakable. Ethan walked faster, trying to steady his breath, though his chest tightened with every step. As he opened his car door, he told himself he just needed to get out of the downtown area, take a drive, calm down, and by tomorrow, everything would become clear. But that fragile confidence lasted only until he looked at his phone. The screen lit up, replaying the slap video instantly, the view count climbing without pause. Comments flashed at him like spikes. He is a racist, fire him, arrest him, make him pay. Ethan tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and sped off like a hunted man. He shot through the familiar streets of Riverton Heights, streets where he once believed he was the enforcer of order, the man everyone feared. Now, each passing street lamp felt like an accusing eye, illuminating the layers of filth from the 10 years he had tried to bury. He turned on his high beams, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he pulled up to his house, a strange silence wrapped around the old 2-story duplex he called his refuge. He stepped onto the porch, and a sudden crash erupted at the window. He jerked back. Glass exploded, outward shards raining down like a storm of cold blades, and a brick rolled to a stop at his feet. On it, smeared in glaring red paint, racist pig. Ethan froze his throat, closing in. He scanned the street. Under the streetlights, he saw shadowy figures dart behind trees, their footsteps fading. They knew where he lived. They had found him faster than he ever imagined. He ran inside, locked every bolt, yanked the curtains shut, and backed up until his spine hit the wall. His home, once a fortress, now felt like a sealed trap cracking at the edges. He called his colleagues. The first didn't answer. The second silenced the call. The third sent him straight to voicemail. Ethan cursed hands, shaking as he scrolled through his contacts. The men who drank beer with him, who relied on him during difficult night shifts, who nodded along when he crossed lines, had vanished as if they never existed. Their silence was louder than any accusation. A thud on the porch made him jump. Something hard struck the front door. Then again. Then a glass bottle shattered, the smell of gasoline spreading through the cold air. The crowd was closing in like animals whipped into frenzy, by the scent of blood. Ethan checked every lock, shoved a heavy cabinet against the door, and retreated into the dark living room. He breathed fast, whispering to himself that they would tire out, that they would eventually leave, that everything cooled after a night's sleep. He spoke as though his own words had weight, but the truth was that every rock thrown, every shout seeping through the walls made him flinch smaller. In his mind, he saw Maya standing still in the station lobby, her cold, commanding gaze burning with quiet certainty. Her words echoed like a heartbeat. The path you chose always has a destination. A heavy crash hit the kitchen window. Ethan dropped to a crouch instantly. The feeling of being surrounded seeped into him like toxic fog. He had never feared anyone, never feared anything. But tonight, in a house trembling under the chaos outside, Ethan admitted a bitter truth for the first time in his life. Fear was undeniable. And no matter how hard he tried to shove the thought away, the cause was clear. Not the crowd, not social media, not the video. It was Maya Thompson, her silence, her calm, her promise that he would pay. The first flames outside began catching on the mailbox, casting an orange glow across the remaining window pane. And Ethan, curled in a dark corner, understood with terrifying clarity that what was happening now was only the first step in a long night with no clear end. Ethan Blake crouched in the darkened living room, his back pressed against the worn sofa, his breath ragged, as though he had just run from a nightmare he was still trapped inside. The fire on the porch had finally died when a light drizzle began to fall, but the smell of smoke clung to his clothes, seeping into every fiber, every corner of the house. The same way fear was beginning to seep into his mind. The small duplex in Riverton Heights, a place he once believed no one dared approach, now felt like a battlefield carrying the scars of a chaotic night. Ethan pushed himself up, grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped it open with his bare hand, and took a long swallow. The cold bitterness sliding down his throat offered a moment's steadiness, but not nearly enough to drown out the pounding thoughts in his skull. Maya Thompson. She, or rather the woman he had so catastrophically underestimated, was turning her words into reality, one by one. You will pay. And tonight, with just the outer layer of the situation peeled back, Ethan understood the slap had not been a moment of impulsive anger. It had been the fuse to a chain reaction he could not control. The alert from the television jolted him. The screen lit up and Maya's image filled it instantly. She stood in front of Riverton City Hall, her deep blue suit sharp under the lights, her face showing no trace of the slap. Her calm presence made her stand out like the eye of the storm that Ethan himself had unleashed. When she spoke, her voice was soft but precise, like a blade sliding across thin skin. Ethan froze. The beer can suspended mid-air. We are launching a full investigation into the 10-year career of Officer Ethan Blake. No one is exempt from accountability. No one is above the law. Two simple sentences, yet they burned across his skin like hot metal. Ethan roared, hurling the beer can against the wall. Foam burst out, streaking down the peeling paint. He grabbed his phone and dialed Kyle Mercer, the only person he believed still had enough shared dirt to stay loyal. Kyle was the kind of cop Ethan understood perfectly, someone who knew the law, but never walked a straight line. 10 years ago, when Ethan went too far and beat Jaden Price in a dark alley, Kyle was the one who doctored the files to turn it into a case of self-defense. The first call rang long and went silent. Ethan frowned and dialed again. No answer. A third time. A fourth. Nothing. It was as if every door he had relied on was slamming shut one after another. He collapsed onto the couch, exhaling heavily. Rage, fear, and confusion pooled together like a thick black sludge. The front porch suddenly rattled, followed by the dull thud of something hitting the steps. Ethan leapt up and peered through the curtains. A soggy piece of paper lay tilted on the porch, soaked by the rain. He cracked the door open just enough to grab it. The sloppy handwriting was still clear enough to turn his spine to ice. "We know where you are, and we do not forget what you've done." Ethan stumbled back inside, locking every bolt with frantic hands before circling the house like a cornered animal. He knew Jaden Price was not the only one. Over 10 years, he had crossed the line more than once, more than twice, countless times. Caught in the act, he got lucky. Recorded on camera. Someone handled it. Ethan had always believed the past would sink into darkness forever and stay buried. But Maya was not someone who could be dismissed. Now she was flipping over every stone in his life, every report, every camera feed, every buried testimony. And what made his skin crawl was the growing certainty that she already knew exactly what he had done. All of it. His phone vibrated. Ethan jumped and snatched it instantly. A message from an unknown number. Just 4 words. "Your past is coming." Ethan felt the ground beneath him splintering. Tonight was only the first layer of the nightmare. Maya had not even struck directly yet, but the early blows, the silence from his colleagues, the eyes of the public, the brick shattering his window, the viral video were more than enough to show him the shadow he could no longer outrun. And the most terrifying truth was this: Maya was not in a hurry. She did not need to be. She held the system. He had only fear. And that fear was just beginning to crawl awake in the dark. Ethan Blake sat frozen in the nearly suffocating darkness of his living room, the only light coming from the silent TV casting a faint glow across the shattered glass on the floor. He felt as if the entire house were tilting, as if Riverton Heights itself had pushed him out of his own life. The nightmare no longer felt abstract. It was forming layer by layer, step by step, blow after blow. He could not sit still any longer. The thought of Maya tearing through everything about him drove Ethan into motion. He needed someone who could stop this, someone who understood the unspoken language between men like him, someone who knew how to make reports disappear, erase camera footage, or at least shield him long enough for the public outrage to cool. Kyle Mercer never answered. Old colleagues avoided him. Internal Affairs was digging. He had only one path left run. Ethan stood, grabbed his keys, slipped out through the back door to avoid the crowd at the front, and ducked through the fence behind the house. The Riverton rain stung cold against his skin. He kept his head low, moving quickly down the narrow alley, trying to keep his shadow hidden from the dim streetlights. His old pickup waited in the rear lot, its paint slick from the rain that had washed away the dust. When he climbed into the driver's seat, his hands trembled so badly he had to grip the wheel hard, just to stop them. He started the engine and sped out of Riverton Heights, racing through empty streets. The tires screeched across the wet asphalt, and in that screech, Ethan could hear the pounding of his own heartbeat, violent and unsteady. He aimed for the Western Industrial District, where shady deals were made, and where anything could be bought if the price was right. One name surfaced in his mind: Owen Ward. A man Ethan had helped cover up several file adjustments for years ago. Owen wasn't clean, but he never betrayed a deal. He lived by transactions. If Ethan paid enough, Owen would find a way to pull him out of Maya's reach. As far away as possible. Nearly 1 hour later, Ethan turned into the abandoned warehouse yard. Yellow lights reflected off the wet concrete, revealing oil stains and rusted patches that looked like open wounds. He parked beside an old warehouse and stepped out, calling Owen. Owen answered on the first ring, his voice low and gravelly. "I heard about it. You are in deep trouble." Ethan clenched his jaw. "I need to disappear. I can pay. Help me tonight." Owen paused for a few seconds, then replied. "Warehouse? Number 9. I'm inside." Ethan rushed toward the designated building. The metal door was cracked open and he slipped inside. No one else was there except Owen, small in build, but with eyes sharp enough to cut. A large, dark canvas bag sat on the table. Ethan assumed it held cash-forged papers, something to help him vanish. Owen tapped the bag lightly and pushed it toward him. "This is your way out." Ethan opened it. A cold shiver shot down his spine. It wasn't money. It wasn't documents. It was small bricks, wrapped in white plastic cocaine, enough to send anyone to prison for decades. Ethan staggered back, his voice stuck in his throat. "What the hell is this?" Owen looked at him with a strangely hollow expression. "Not my doing. Someone hired me. You are too expensive to keep around." Ethan barely had time to react before blinding headlights flooded the warehouse, slicing through the darkness. Federal vehicles rolled in, doors slammed. Agents in jackets stamped with federal agent rushed in with guns raised. Ethan froze, and Owen slipped out the back door without a sound. The commanding agent's voice echoed off the metal walls. "Ethan Blake, you are under arrest for possession and distribution of illegal narcotics." Ethan screamed panic, ripping out of him with a desperation he had never felt. "That is not mine. I am being set up. This is a trap." But the warehouse swallowed his pleas, and the only thing he felt next was a rough hand yanking his arms back, the cuffs locking cold and unyielding against his skin. As he was forced onto the wet concrete floor, Ethan finally understood something he had always mocked in others. Once luck abandons you, the entire world seems to collapse at the same time. And deeper than humiliation, deeper than the desperate screams, one paralyzing truth crystallized in his mind. Maya did not need to touch him. All she had to do was begin. The system would turn for her on its own, and Ethan Blake had only reached the outer ring of the storm. Ethan Blake was shoved into the back seat of the federal vehicle, his head slamming against the metal door frame as the agent shut it without the slightest restraint. The mix of sweat-cold steel and the sharp scent of body armor from the agents outside blended into something that churned in his stomach. The car jolted violently as it hit a rough patch of road, but Ethan barely felt anything beyond the terror tightening around his throat. He had been dropped into a perfect trap, no evidence to fight back. No witness to speak for him, no ally left on his side, only the bag filled with cocaine now carrying his fingerprints from the moment he had touched it. The layers of the setup were so precise that Ethan knew instantly this was not Owen's doing. It was not a rash act from the angry public. This was Maya. And she had made her move long before he could open his mouth to defend himself. When they arrived at the federal headquarters, the footsteps of agents striking the stone floor sounded like nails being hammered into a coffin. Ethan was dragged inside, shoved into the interrogation room, and seated between 4 gray, silent walls. The overhead light was so bright it stabbed at his eyes. A federal agent opened a file on the table, his voice calm and flat, as if delivering an evening news report. "The amount of illegal substances is enough to charge you with a major felony, and we have video footage of you opening the bag at warehouse number 9. Ethan wanted to scream that it was staged, that every piece of it was planted, but each word he forced out sank into the icy void of the agent's indifference. He fell silent only because he realized no explanation would matter. Then the door behind him opened. A woman walked in. Not Maya. It was Diane Teller, the low-budget attorney assigned by the federal office when a defendant had no legal representation. Her suit was wrinkled, her hair tied in a rushed knot, her eyes avoiding his. Ethan felt the world pushing him deeper into the mud. Diane whispered, "I will do my best, but your situation is difficult." Ethan let out a fractured, bitter laugh. Difficult. My entire life is being crushed. That is what you call difficult. The attorney stayed quiet, unable to meet his gaze. Half an hour later, Ethan was moved to a holding cell. He sat on the freezing metal bench, his head buried in his hands. Someone in the next cell tapped the wall rhythmically, like the ticking of a bomb about to go off. Ethan tried to steady his breath, tried to scrape together some fraction of logic. He needed a way out. Someone at the station who might believe him. Some flaw in Maya's plan. A federal agent's phone rang suddenly, once then, twice. He stood up and stepped outside to answer it. The door remained slightly open, just enough for Ethan to hear the key parts. "The video has hit national media already. The whole country's watching. Tell them to prepare an emergency press briefing." Ethan felt the blow hit him in the gut. He jumped to his feet, grabbed the bars, and held them so tightly his fingers turned pale. An emergency briefing. National attention. Maya would be the one standing before the cameras. She would tell the story in a way that painted him as a predator roaming the streets of Riverton. She would expose 10 years of him hiding behind twisted power. Ethan felt the ground disappear beneath him. 1 hour later, 2 federal agents entered to announce he was being released on bail pending trial due to an error in the search warrant. He could barely process it. Released now. Over a minor procedural flaw the system almost never missed. But when he stepped outside the federal building, the answer stood a few meters away. Maya. She did not walk toward him. She did not speak. She simply watched him. Her expression calm, the kind of calm held by someone who already knew every step he was about to take, every trap he would fall into, every piece of his life about to collapse. Ethan wanted to scream at her, to shout that she could not destroy him, that he still had moves left, that this was not over. But when he looked into her eyes, completely unmarked now, untouched by the slap, he realized she did not need to shout. She did not need to threaten. She did not need to lift a hand. All she had to do was begin. The system would do the rest. Ethan turned away, trying to steady his steps, but inside he felt one truth crawl coldly up his spine. He was not walking back into his life. He was being released, only to be hunted again. And Maya Thompson had only just begun. Ethan Blake stepped back into the Riverton night like a man thrown out of a storm that had not finished tearing itself apart. The air was cool, but every breath he took burned hot, as if he were setting fire to himself from the inside. The federal agents released him without a backward glance, as though they already knew when a predator has had its fangs torn out, whether it survives or dies no longer matters. Ethan stood for a moment on the stone steps, gripping the edge of his coat, trying to convince himself that this was an opportunity. A small crack in the door, a final escape route. Then he looked to his right. Maya Thompson stood there straight, backed her eyes, still and dark as a midnight lake. No anger, no mockery. only the absolute certainty of someone who knew every step he took from this moment forward would lead exactly where she intended. Ethan turned away before her stare could cut into the weakest part of him. He climbed into his old pickup truck, started the engine, and shot on to the highway as if chased by something he could not see. The sparse traffic slipped past streetlights, stretching into blurry golden streaks. Ethan checked the rearview mirror more times than he inhaled. He kept expecting headlights behind him, a black SUV, a shadow stepping from the trees, another trap, but nothing came. Riverton fell away behind him like a city choosing not to intervene, and that silence terrified him more than any pursuit could. Maya did not need to chase him. She let him run because she knew runners always exposed their own weaknesses. Ethan left the highway and pulled into a small gas station on the outskirts of a quiet town. Flickering neon lights cast a sickly glow across his face, revealing deep shadows under his eyes and the tense lines carved along his temples. He leaned against the truck, inhaling slowly, as though preparing to submerge himself underwater before diving into a black abyss. He needed a plan. Someone who still owed him. Someone who might pull at the last thread tying him to the power he once held. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A new message from an unknown number. 2 words, "Keep going." A chill crawled up the back of his neck. He looked around. The gas station attendant was hunched over his phone, not paying attention. No one seemed to be watching him. Yet the timing of the message felt like a whisper from a hidden vantage point. Ethan didn't respond. He tossed the phone onto the dashboard, pressing his palms together to stop the shaking. He closed his eyes, rummaging through the list of people he could still reach for help. Faces flashed through his mind, each one fading as quickly as it appeared. Everyone would avoid him now. Everyone understood Maya held absolute power. She was not just the chief, she was the symbol. The entire city stood behind her. Who would dare stand with Ethan now? Who would dare turn their back on her? But then he remembered someone. Not a cop. Not a lawyer. A man who operated in the shadows. Roy Nash. A dealer of secrets and underground broker who always knew what currents were running beneath the system. Nash had once said, "If you ever need me, you know where to find me. I know which doors still open." Ethan never thought he would need someone like Nash. But tonight he had no other choice. He sped toward the east side of Riverton, where abandoned red brick buildings slumped along potholed streets. A row of old warehouses lined the road, rusting and forgotten. The streetlights flickered like dying filaments. Ethan stopped at the 6th building, the place he and Nash used for exchanging hidden files in the past. He knocked. No answer. Knocked harder. Still nothing. He was about to turn away when the door flung open and Nash appeared, eyes bloodshot, as if he had not slept for days. "Are you out of your mind, Ethan? The whole city is hunting you. People are saying you are the biggest racist in the Riverton force, and you have the guts to show up here." "I need information," Ethan said through clenched teeth, his desperation impossible to hide. "I was set up. I need to know who is involved. I need to know what Maya is doing." Nash barked a short laugh, though fear tinged its edges. "You still don't get it, do you? Maya does not need to set you up. You did all of this yourself, and if she has stepped in, trust me, no one is saving you." Ethan stepped closer until their faces were almost touching, his voice cracking. "I need a way out, Roy. I cannot let her destroy my life over a slap." Nash stared at him for a long moment, his gaze darting around as if weighing whether this was worth the risk. Finally, he spoke in a low whisper. "I can help you disappear, but only once. One chance. and you leave the city tonight." Ethan nodded, every nerve in his body pulled taut. Nash handed him the key to another warehouse and told him to wait there. As Ethan walked away, Nash called out one last warning: "Pray. She does not find you before I finish." Ethan drove to warehouse number 13. No movement, no lights. Only the sound of rain tapping softly on the metal roof. He stood inside the darkness, trying to steady his breath, trying to convince himself he still had a way out. Then headlights flared at the end of the road. A black SUV rolled toward him, its beams blinding him until he shielded his face. Two large figures jumped out, moving quickly in his direction. Ethan stumbled backward on instinct, reaching for anything to defend himself, but finding only empty pockets. A voice cut through the cold air, sharp as winter wind sliding down a hill. Ethan Blake. His knees nearly buckled. Not federal agents, not reporters, not civilians. It was Riverton police, his former colleagues. As they approached, he recognized the insignia on their chests. The Special Response Unit. The team that reported directly to Maya. "We have orders to bring you in," one of them said, his voice devoid of emotion. Why, Ethan gasped. "I am out on bail. You have no right." The other officer cut him off, his eyes colder than steel. "There is new information, new evidence. You are being summoned for further questioning." Ethan laughed, a trembling, broken sound escaping him like shattered glass. "What evidence? What else is left for me to lose?" The officer tilted his head slightly, looking at Ethan the way one might look at a doomed man. "You should ask Maya that." Ethan clenched his fists, his breath tightening into painful bursts. He understood now more clearly than ever, Maya was not just taking him down. She was peeling his life apart layer by layer like stripping an onion with no end. And with each layer removed, Ethan choked harder on bitterness and panic. As they escorted him into the SUV, Ethan looked through the narrow crack of the window and saw Riverton blur into darkness. Warehouse number 13 faded behind the rain as if it had never existed. And in that moment, Ethan realized a brutal truth: he had never been running from Maya. He had been running along the exact path she drew for him. Every step, every trap, every collapse. Maya did not need to chase him. She only needed him to keep going. Ethan Blake was shoved into the back seat of the Special Response Unit's SUV, his wrists bound tightly in front of him, his shoulders aching from being pressed down too hard. The door slammed shut, sealing him inside, an air thick with the smell of rain leather upholstery and the cold metal bite of the handcuffs cutting into his skin. The vehicle pulled away from warehouse number 13, its tires grinding over the wet pavement like the whispered continuation of a sentence in a death warrant. Through the window, Ethan watched the streetlights slide past in reverse, each one a small marker signaling how far he was falling into a tunnel with no exit. He leaned his head back, searching desperately for the sense of control that had kept him steady through 10 years on the force. But now, in the cramped darkness of the SUV, he felt like nothing more than damaged cargo, a burden the system wanted to discard as quickly as possible. The two officers in the front did not speak. They only exchanged cold glances through the rearview mirror. Ethan saw something in those eyes, something like muted satisfaction, the kind of grim pleasure people feel when watching someone who once stood above them being dragged to the bottom. The car turned toward the center of Riverton, the red glow of traffic lights flashing across his face like streaks of blood. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to steady the trembling in his breath. He did not know what Maya was preparing, but he knew one thing: this was not additional questioning. If Maya wanted to question him, she would have done it at the station. If she wanted to investigate, she would have sent internal affairs. But dispatching the special response unit in the middle of the night meant only one thing. She wanted him to understand he was in her hands, and she could crush him whenever she wished. The SUV stopped in front of Riverton's old federal building, a place once used to interrogate high-level offenders. Its weathered gray stone walls looked like the jaws of something waiting to swallow him whole. The heavy doors swung open, and Ethan was dragged out stumbling as cold rain hit his face, unable to cool the fire boiling in his chest. Inside the corridor, stretched out in a long line of chipped tile and flickering yellow lights casting warped shadows along the walls. They pushed him into an interrogation room. Ethan immediately turned around, his voice shaky with anger and fear. Why was I brought here? I did not sign anything. No one told me. One officer shut the door, his voice flat and empty. Someone will speak with you. Ethan slammed his hands on the metal table, the sound echoing like a plea disguised as a threat. I want an explanation. I have a right. The door opened, and Maya Thompson walked in. Not hurried, not tense. She carried no backup. She entered alone, her long dark coat still dotted with raindrops, her hair tied back, her eyes sharp and composed, as if chaos had never touched her life. Ethan fell silent, not out of fear, but out of a sensation he had never felt before: smallness. She sat down and placed a thick folder on the table, flipping through the pages, as if reviewing a schedule prepared well in advance. The sound of each page turning echoed in the room, like his heartbeat skipping its rhythm. Without looking at him, Maya spoke, her voice steady and cutting. A new lead uncovered an old file, a case from 2017, a victim who filed a complaint against you before being pressured into withdrawing it. This name, you remember him, Ethan. She slid the photograph toward him. Ethan felt the air vanish from the room. He knew the face instantly. A black man he once stopped, broke a rib with his baton, then forced to sign a confession. Ethan opened his mouth, but his voice came out weaker than he intended. I followed protocol. Maya lifted her eyes. They were no longer cold. They were deeper, calmer, as if she were reading the parts of him he had buried even from himself. What protocol allows you to shatter someone's life just to protect your own ego? Ethan lowered his head, fingers gripping the edge of the table, the tips turning white. He realized he was standing before someone he once believed he could intimidate with a single slap. But the woman in front of him was not a victim, not someone fragile. She was the one holding the entire machinery of Riverton's justice system in her hands. Maya stood closing the folder. She stepped toward Ethan, stopping just a few paces away. Her voice was soft, but sharp as a blade. Every layer of your wrongdoing will be brought into the light, not because I hate you, but because you have broken too many people, and justice still owes them an answer. She turned, hand on the door. Before leaving, she said only one sentence: "Tonight is only the beginning." The door shut behind her. Ethan Blake sat there, his hands slack, his throat dry, and for the first time, he understood he was no longer running from Maya. He was being dragged step by step into the very shadow he had created across 10 long years. From the perspective of a specialist in systemic justice, Maya's journey and Ethan's downfall reveal that power is never immune to the truth. A single slap, seemingly small, exposed an entire decade of abuse, proving that the quiet composure of the underestimated can sometimes become the greatest force to shift the balance of justice. If you believe in the value of transparency and accountability, please like and subscribe to help spread these stories. And leave a short comment. Stand up.